Hello everyone, and welcome to another Fun Fact Friday here at the Crockett Tavern Museum in Morristown, Tennessee. Today we're going to be following up on our last episode by discussing a prominent figure in American folklore who featured very heavily in the expansion and establishment of the alcohol industry. Now, some of you might have already guessed who we're going to be talking about today, going off the pot on my head. But for those of you who are a little slow on the draw, well, I'll spare you the suspense. Today we're going to be talking about John Chapman, who is more prominently known as Johnny Appleseed. But before we get into today's video, I'm going to go ahead and take this pot off my head because, as you probably guessed, it's not the most comfortable headwear by any means. Oh, the things I do for you folks. Well, today's topic is, as previously mentioned, John Chapman or Johnny Appleseed. Now, when most people hear the name Johnny Appleseed, they tend to think of a barefoot man who roamed the country wearing a pot on his head and toting a bag full of apple seeds from which he would plant a variety of delicious apples for consumption. If you are one of those who adheres to that notion, then it's probably owed to the popularity of a segment from a 1948 Disney feature called Melody Time, which depicts Chapman in a Cinderella-like fashion surrounded by blue songbirds and a jolly guardian angel. But this notion is tainted by our modern perception of the apple as a sweet, edible fruit. In fact, the apples that Chapman were planting were much more different than the apples that we see in the supermarkets and farmers markets today. The apples at the time, you see, were actually being used primarily to make America's favorite beverage of choice, hard apple cider. Now, before Prohibition, apples at this time were far less likely to be eaten as opposed to winding up in a barrel of cider. And in rural communities, cider was so popular that it often took the place of wine and beer, tea and coffee, juice, and even water. And the reason for this is that in a time and a place where water sources could be contaminated with dangerous bacteria, cider provided a safe, stable source of drink for people, and it could be imbibed without worry. Cider, suffice it to say, was an important aspect of frontier life, as were the apples that were being used to make it. And it was into this apple-laden world that John Chapman was born on September 26, 1774, in Leominster, Massachusetts. Now, not much is known about Chapman's early years, but we see him emerge onto the pages of history in the early 1800s on the western Pennsylvania border at the edge of America's rapidly expanding frontier. Ever the savvy businessman, Chapman figured that if he went ahead of the settlers, planted orchards, and then turned around and sold them for a profit, he could make quite a name for himself as well as making a little bit of money along the way. So wandering from Pennsylvania to Illinois, that's exactly what he did. And once he had sold off his previous orchards, he would move ahead of the settlers yet again to more undeveloped land. But it should be noted that, like the caricature of Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman did in fact tote a bag of apple seeds around wherever he went. However, being a member of the Swedenborgian Church, whose belief system explicitly forbade grafting, this meant that all of Chapman's apples were planted from seed and were not exactly the most edible thing to have on the table. And it's not that Chapman or the settlers didn't have any knowledge about grafting, but like most, they went ahead and figured that their time was much better spent growing these apples for the making of cider as opposed to consumption. Unfortunately, we see that in later years, John Chapman passed away in 1845, and his orchards and apple varieties didn't last much longer. Yet, Johnny Appleseed is destined to wander in the realm of Disney, roaming through America's collective memory, toting a bag of perfectly edible, gleaming apples. But folks, now you know, we've stripped away the veneer of the Disney segment, and we've told you the truth behind the legend of John Chapman or Johnny Appleseed. So bearing in mind this knowledge that you have recently acquired, next time you get ready to celebrate Johnny Appleseed Day, suffice it to say, you'll probably think to yourself, it's a little bit more appropriate to celebrate his legacy by consuming this as opposed to consuming this. Nonetheless, folks, you celebrate Johnny Appleseed Day however you want to, and when it comes to the option of wearing a pot on your head in order to honor his memory, that's completely optional, all right? But folks, this concludes our Fun Fact Friday for the week. We want to thank you so much for joining along as we discover what life was like in the 18th and 19th century. For those of you who have been following along on Facebook and YouTube, we want to thank you so much for your support. But, of course, the best support is by coming to the Crockett Tavern Museum and paying us a visit. As always, our hours of operation as well as admission fees will be listed in the description along with the video. So until next week, this is Isaac White signing off for now, saying goodbye and God bless.